Vaccines, are they safe and effective? Dr. Paul Offit says yes. Dr. Boyd Haley says no. Dr. Offit argues that vaccines are all that stand between us and a plague of infectious diseases, that while admittedly a few of us are injured by vaccines, the vast majority are protected by them. Dr. Haley argues that vaccines are not very effective at all, and that our childhood vaccine program has been responsible for disabling an entire generation of children. Vaccines, a virtual debate about the greatest medical controversy of our time.
So, as a pediatrician, you wouldn't deepen your knowledge of molecular biology or the brain or other things like that. That would be referred out to another specialist. For example, if you saw a child with a concussion or you saw with a child with some kind of brain injury, you wouldn't treat that, would you?
No, it's, in other words, what I am is I'm Chief of Infectious Diseases here at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And so what we do here in the Infectious Disease Division is we see children who are inpatients who have severe or chronic or persistent or unknown infectious diseases, or we see children as outpatients who generally are referred by pediatricians in the community with an infectious disease that they're having difficulty handling.
You know, the real problem with people like Dr. Offit, they have no training in toxicology at all. Medical doctors do not receive training in toxicology to the extent that would qualify them to comment on whether or not an injection of a certain amount of a toxic chemical like the aerosol or mercury in the body would be toxic. They're just not trained to evaluate that.
Vaccines are the best of two worlds. What they do is they induce roughly the same immune response that would induce by natural infection without having to pay the price of natural infection.
That's just totally not true. There's a big difference in the immune response between a natural infection and getting an injection. For example, if you get injected with the measles vaccine, you can get the measles. People do. If you get the measles, if you get it naturally, you'll never get the measles a second time.
So best of both worlds. You get the immune response that will protect you against a subsequent measles challenge, but you don't have to pay the price of measles infection, which can be a high price.
Most Americans want to believe that that's the case. But the bottom line is, in the United States, we vaccinate earlier and more often and for more diseases than any other country in the world, yet we have the highest infant death rate of the 43 most modern countries. We're at the bottom of the heap with regard to being able to protect our children. And I think a legitimate question to ask is, if our vaccines are preventing infectious diseases and deaths from infectious diseases, what are American children dying of that make them have one of the highest infant death rates in the world?
It's certainly true, actually, that if you look at diseases like whooping cough, or even to a lesser extent diphtheria, you start to see some decline as we got, better sanitation, better hygiene in our country. But you didn't start to see a dramatic decline in virtual elimination of those diseases until we introduced vaccines.
I think he's totally wrong, and the data shows that he's not correct in that assumption. We saw the major drops in death from many infectious diseases, say starting at 1900, when they started keeping records, 1900, 1910, until about 1940, 1950. Those rates of those diseases dropped dramatically. Before the vaccines were ever introduced, they dropped over 90%. And so the bigger drops were before the vaccines were produced.
This chart of deaths from pertussis, or whooping cough, is from Vital and Historical Statistics of the United States from 1900 to 1968. It shows a dramatic decline in deaths from pertussis well before the pertussis vaccine came into widespread use in the 1940s. The death rate falls from as many as 17 per 100,000 in 1918 to less than 2 before the vaccine came into widespread use in the late 1940s. This chart of New York City mortality rates tracks infectious disease from 1880 to 1911. It shows that deaths from diphtheria, the blue line, fell precipitously from a high of 175 deaths per 100,000 in 1882 to less than 25 by 1911. Deaths from the croup also declined dramatically during the same period, yet there is no vaccine for the croup. This chart of United States mortality rates shows that continued deaths from diphtheria had fallen below 15 per 100,000 before the vaccine was introduced in 1920. Pertussis fell from as many as 16 per 100,000 in 1907 and 17 per 100,000 in 1919 to fewer than 1 by 1951. The vaccine was in use from the 1940s, but sizable drops occurred well before it was introduced. Measles, the green line, fell to less than 2 per 100,000 in 1940, a full 25 years before the vaccine was first introduced in 1963. Typhoid, the dark blue line, and scarlet fever, the red line, also declined dramatically over the same period without a vaccine. This graph shows the decline of all 5 diseases. Some declined before a vaccine, others declined without one.
Well, you know, when you talk about how much money the vaccine program costs the American public, we're spending billions of dollars on vaccines. And maybe we would be better served if we took that billions of dollars and spent it on hygiene and good food, and maybe the availability of antibiotics in certain areas. Because I think antibiotics and hygiene have done a lot more to reduce the amount of infectious diseases in this country than have the vaccine program.
And so I live in Philadelphia and therefore feel compelled to quote Ben Franklin whenever possible, but an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that's always true. You'd much rather prevent something than to try and have to treat it.
Well, I agree with that, and I'm trying to prevent infant deaths and sicknesses caused by an injection of mercury into their bodies.
What I would argue, though, is that we can be very proud of vaccines because the kind of catchment systems, safety catchment systems for vaccines, like so-called VAERS or Vaccine Safety Data Link, frankly don't exist for drugs.
Well, I'm not so sure they exist effectively for vaccines either. Less than 1 out of 10 adverse effects are reported. And I would say that if you think that vaccines are so safe, then explain to me why this country that has the highest vaccine and the earliest vaccine rate in the world has such a high level of infant mortality. Much higher than those who give much less vaccines and give them a lot later in the child's life.
I think vaccines are very safe. Often we use the sort of dichotomy of safe, unsafe. I think more fairly one should say very safe, because vaccines, like anything that induces an effect in the body, can induce a side effect, and certainly vaccines do have side effects. But I think one can argue that their benefits clearly outweigh their risks, and unfortunately their risks are often misunderstood by the public.
Vaccines should be totally safe. You shouldn't be injecting anything into a baby that is toxic and known to be toxic, that increases the health risk to that baby. And that's what we've been doing. We're injecting aluminum and mercury, ethyl mercury, into these children. And in some of the vaccines, we've seen that they have component parts of DNA from pigs and bovine and chickens, etc., that are also being injected. That's not safe to do that.
Do vaccines cause autism?
No, vaccines don't cause autism.
Absolutely sure.
Absolutely sure.
Okay.
It doesn't make sense that they would. Biologically, it never made sense that they would. And now we have a wealth of epidemiological studies proving that they didn't.
Autism didn't exist before we started using organic mercury in vaccines and other biological systems. It went up in all 50 states at the same time. At the same time, we started the CDC mandated vaccine program. There has to be an environmental toxin, because we have established there is no genetic cause of autism. It didn't exist, and you don't have genetics cause epidemics. You can have a genetic susceptibility to a toxin, introduce a new toxin, and you can cause an epidemic. And I think that's where the autism thing is. These are genetically susceptible people being exposed to a new toxin. What would be this toxin? If it can't be coal-fired power plants or something that's unequally distributed around the country, then it has to be something that the child is exposed to before 2 years of age. Because the average age of diagnosis is 4.5 years of age. So they have to be exposed quite early in life. The vaccine program fits that. And you have to say it has to be something that affects boys more than girls. Well, the thimerosal, there's no doubt about it. Mercury affects the male species much more than it does the female species. And then number 4, you have to look at all the biological effects. Dr. Offit is ignorant of the biochemistry involved in autism if he says mercury or thimerosal exposure can't cause that.
You can't claim that vaccines are in any way a contributor, a real contributor to autism, and then not find it in epidemiological studies. The reason that you don't find it is it's not there to be found. The truth is vaccines don't cause autism.
But then why do all these parents say, we got a vaccine, then my child got autism, like right after?
Yeah, perfectly reasonable. I mean, I think, from a parent standpoint, their child was fine, they got a vaccine, and then they weren't fine anymore. The question is, did the vaccine cause it? I mean, just because one event follows another, it doesn't mean that it's causally associated with the other. And hence, you do the kinds of studies that allow you to answer that question.
There is nothing but solid proof that thimerosal is incredibly toxic at the very lowest level, added to any cells and culture, injected into any animal, or in any study where we've looked at that exposure. Even applying it to the skin of a baby caused them to get so toxic that they died.
Wouldn't you be able to say, okay, let's look at this. Is there a population in Chicago that went through this healthcare system that did not get autism and did not get vaccines? Can we determine that that would be true or false?
I think what you would have to do, if you were going to look, for example, at an unvaccinated population in Chicago, a homeschooled population in Chicago, and try and compare them then to the surrounding community where say, vaccine rates are where they should be, is you would have to prospectively do that study, which is to say because you have to control for the fact that the healthcare seeking behavior is different. I mean, you could do that study, but it would not be an ethical study. First of all, it's not ethical not to give vaccines to children because children can die of vaccine-preventable diseases. And when you do that, who's responsible for that?
This is something that all the people in the immunology or vaccine program fight totally against, and that's to look at the effect of the rate of autism in the non-vaccinated population, the non-thimerosal exposed population, versus that of an exposed population. They will do anything to avoid doing that and make any excuse. What he's saying is absurd. It's easy to go through and get a large general population of people that have not been vaccinated and look at them and look at the autism rate in that group. Our government has that data. They can definitely obtain it. But the vaccine manufacturers and the people who make money off of giving vaccines do not want this looked at, because what it does and will show and has shown is that the people who do not get vaccinated or do not get exposed to thimerosal do not have nearly the rate of autism as do those that do.
It's frankly been done in the Amish community, and now one knows that in the Amish community the rates of autism probably are exactly identical to that in the surrounding community. In fact, there are clinics for children who are Amish that have autism. So that original hypothesis was wrong.
Dan Olmsted was a reporter for UPI who went to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, went to the clinics there and tried to find Amish that were autistic. I know they don't vaccinate nearly as much. They don't have their babies in hospitals like most people do. So they definitely aren't getting that vaccine on the day of birth, most of them. Let's see what the Amish autism rate is. And he couldn't find very many. And the ones he found had been vaccinated. So I would say that this is still a viable option. And I would tell you that since then I have read a study where they looked at homeschooled children, an epidemiological study where they sent out a form asking them to look at if their children were vaccinated and if any of them had any medical problems such as autism, pneumonia, etc. And the take-home lesson from that study was that the unvaccinated children were much more healthy than the vaccinated children. And they had a much lower rate of autism and asthma, etc. And that the vaccinated children were much more likely to get sick later on in life with pneumonia. They had more hospital calls, etc.
Well, have we really taken thimerosal out of vaccines
Yeah,
entirely?
there are multi-dose preparations of influenza vaccine which are given to greater than 2 years old, which may contain thimerosal at preservative levels. And I think there's a preparation of diphtheria, tetanus-containing vaccine which contains thimerosal at preservative levels, but that's it. Now that we essentially have removed ethyl mercury from vaccine, certainly to any vaccine that's given to a less than 2-year-old, they don't receive preservative levels of mercury. The incidence of autism, if anything, is only increased.
Well, you know, they say it's not, first of all, that's not true. Thimerosal is still used in the vaccine manufacturing process. They just don't add it as a preservative anymore. But you still have a certain level, about 1/10 the level that used to be there is still there. And all the vaccines that are used in multiple dose vials, like the flu vaccine that they recommend for 6-month-old children, still contains thimerosal. They're getting a bolus dose of mercury when you inject your baby with the flu vaccine at the local clinics. It's the same as it was in 1985 when we started the CDC mandated program. It's quite a high level. It's 12.5 micrograms per dose of mercury. That means it would be safe for a baby to take, according to EPA standards, eating fish if the baby weighed 275 pounds. It's not against the law to give thimerosal containing vaccines. And an HMO can go to the vaccine manufacturer or a state health agency and say, we want to buy vaccines and we want the cheapest because we don't have a big budget. Can I buy this thimerosal containing vaccine for our children, for the children that are being vaccinated in our state, our location, our HMO? And yes, they can. It's not against the law. And so you're trusting whether these people will buy the thimerosal-free vaccines. And I know that they don't do it all the time because I've had mothers call me up and say, Dr. Haley, I have to get my child vaccinated. What should I do? And I tell them you want to see the insert to show that the vaccine they're giving is thimerosal-free. And you look at a preservative and see if it says there's thimerosal. And so many times they've called me back over the last few years saying, no, the vaccine they want to give my child contained thimerosal. So there is no proof that the thimerosal has been removed from exposure to American children. They like saying that so people calm down, people like me.
One thing that I don't know whether it's Boyd Haley or whether it was the guys in there's guys in Calgary, but I think Boyd Haley also did this. They took brain neurons, snail brain neurons, and they put a solution of different heavy metals on the neuron. And what they show, at least on camera, is the neuron being torn apart when they put a solution of mercury on there. And as I understand it, it's elemental mercury, but I'm not certain. Maybe you can correct me on it. And then they also say when they add aluminum to that mix, it catalyzes the reaction.
Shown here is the neurite of a live neuron isolated from snail brain tissue, displaying linear growth due to growth cone activity. It is important to note that growth cones in all animal species, ranging from snails to humans, have identical structural and behavioral characteristics and use proteins of virtually identical composition. In this experiment, neurons also isolated from snail brain tissue were grown in culture for several days, after which very low concentrations of mercury were added to the culture medium for 20 minutes. Over the next 30 minutes, the neurite membrane underwent rapid degeneration, leaving behind the denuded neurofibrils seen here. In contrast, other heavy metals added at this same concentration, such as aluminum, lead, cadmium, and manganese, did not produce this effect.
Are you familiar with that? Do you have a response to that? Explain that in a different way? Or?
No, I think that historically in medicine, that studies in laboratory cells or studies in experimental animals are not always predictive of events in children.
Well, you know, he's saying, let's don't look at any of the science. And it's not always. No, it isn't always. But primarily, you can usually explain, if there's a toxic effect of some material, you can biologically explain it by doing laboratory type studies like I did. I mean, that study in Calgary came off of the studies. I worked with those guys early on, showing that mercury added to normal human brain tissue would induce the same biochemical abnormalities found in Alzheimer's disease brain. This means that exposure to mercury can have a dramatic effect on somebody who's very prone to getting Alzheimer's disease, whatever the cause. The people at Calgary and I did a study together. We took rats and put them in a mercury vapor chamber and had them breathe mercury vapor for various periods of time, and then sacrificed them at various periods of time, looked at the mercury in their brain and the quality of the tubulin, the protein that's being affected in AD brain most dramatically. And we got the same result. Exposing rats to mercury vapor caused the tubulin in their brain to dissipate, not become functional. Then later at Calgary, they did a study on the neurons in culture, and they showed that mercury, and only mercury, which is what I had found, that only mercury would cause these biochemical abnormalities when added to normal brain, human brain homogeneous. They found the same thing in the neurons in culture, that mercury and only mercury at those very, very low levels would cause the tubulin to disintegrate or fall apart and form neurofibrillary tangles, which is the pathological hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. And I would say since then, just recently, people in Korea have published a paper showing that mercury also, when added to cells in culture, neuronal cells in culture, will cause the buildup of beta amyloid plaques. In other words, mercury now can be shown to increase neurofibrillary tangles, beta amyloid plaques, tau hyperphosphorylation, which are the three pathological hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. And yet our government refuses to take the lead on this and look at this solid science done all over the world, including the United States, to decrease the rate of Alzheimer's disease in this country. And that's prevented by removing exposure to mercury.
Let's get back to this same point. The Burbacher study, what Burbacher appears to be saying is it's not, ethyl mercury is not eliminated from the body. It just clears the blood. It goes to the organs. Is that new information or is that disputed information?
No, what Burbacher found is that it is possible for mercury, either as ethyl mercury or methyl mercury, to exist in the brain as essentially inorganic mercury, that the methyl or ethyl mercury molecule gets cleaved off. Is that toxic? Is that dangerous? There's no evidence that that's true. His study in experimental monkeys showed something that is interesting, but has, to my knowledge, no correlate in harm. I mean, it's certainly known that organic mercury in the form of methyl mercury can be harmful, or logarithmically higher quantities of ethyl mercury that logarithmically higher than one is getting in vaccines is harmful. But the important thing is the proof is in the pudding. If it was harmful, then it should be shown in a study to be harmful. And the most sensitive way to answer that question is with an epidemiological study, not with an animal model study, not with a study of cells in a laboratory. If you want to know whether or not something is harmful in children, test it in children. And that's been done redundantly.
So you're saying elemental mercury in the brain is not a problem
I don't
that
know.
you know of?
I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting finding.
I mean, I'm just really taken back by that comment. I mean, the studies with rats, and they did this with rabbits. They injected rabbits with radioactive thimerosal, and it cleared the blood 75% within 6 hours. But while it was clearing the blood, it was going up in all the other organs of the body dramatically. It wasn't leaving the rabbit. The rabbit didn't urinate all that mercury. It doesn't leave the body that fast. That's documented scientific studies. Thimerosal does not leave the body within a short period of time. Leaving the blood is just the first step of it getting into the other tissues where it has its toxic effects, and it may be the first step in a long and prolonged aspect of getting mercury out of the body totally. But it does not prevent it from being toxic. It's in the body plenty long enough to cause major toxic effects. That's well established. And why he wants to say that this indicates that the thimerosal is removed when we vaccinate into children, it's gone in 6 hours or a certain number of hours, he's totally wrong. None of the science that's been published would support that.
So you can't claim that vaccines are in any way a contributor, a real contributor to autism, and then not find it in epidemiological studies. The reason that you don't find it is it's not there to be found.
With regard to his epidemiological studies, those were mainly funded by the CDC. None of them were done by Americans. They were done primarily in Denmark by a guy who's now on the most wanted list by the Department of Justice for embezzling money from that same program. They were loaded with statistical manipulations to reverse what would be considered a logical find. For example, in a study by Madsen, which is one of them he talks about, they said that removing a toxic material, thimerosal, which is a neurotoxin, exposure, removing that exposure from infants, caused the autism rate to increase 20-fold. That's in their figure 1 of their thing. That's a ridiculous find. Totally ridiculous find. And we have since looked at that in detail and found out that they did a very, very selective and very poor data collection job. And we have now published a paper where we talk about 6 publications funded by the CDC or involved with CDC people as well, most of them done in Europe, that flagrantly ignore the rules of statistics to get the answers they want. It's that old line from Mark Twain, liars, damn liars, and statisticians. They were paid to get the results showing that the thimerosal was safe and was not causing a toxic effect. And doing that, they broke all the rules of statistical analysis. And we have detailed that in a publication that's currently out.
An earlier review of all but one of the epidemiological or statistical studies that Dr. Offit refers to were carried out before 2003. They were reviewed as part of a 3-year congressional investigation and hearing ending in that year, according to the report of the investigation. To date, studies conducted or funded by the CDC that purportedly dispute any correlation between autism and vaccine injury have been of poor design, underpowered, and fatally flawed. The CDC's rush to support and promote such research is reflective of a philosophical conflict in looking fairly at emerging theories and clinical data related to adverse reactions from vaccinations.
I mean, mercury certainly is a toxin. There's no doubt about it. But as Paracelsus said, in the 16th century, the dose makes the poison. I mean, that's always true.
Yes, he talks about Paracelsus, and there is a bit of logic to that. Of course, everybody knows if you drink 1 beer, you're not going to get as drunk as if you drink 10. So there is a tie-in of that. But then when you compare it, when you look at thimerosal, and you say, what level of thimerosal is toxic in a baby that starts causing toxic issues, and how close to that level do you get when you give a vaccine, you realize that the dose is quite toxic that you're injecting into these children. I mean, he's mindless about this. Plus, we also know that in the case of mercury, there have been studies done showing the synergistic effect with lead, cadmium, and certain other things such as aluminum, and which we showed in the neuron study with aluminum. If you put in thimerosal and then add either lead, cadmium, or aluminum, you dramatically increase the toxicity of that level of mercury. Mercury is synergistically enhanced by the presence of most other metals. In the one study that's been published, when they took a non-toxic level of mercury and a non-toxic level of lead, 1/20th of that, mixed the two together, they developed a material or a solution that was 100% effective at killing rats. It killed 100% of the rats, when it should, if it were additive, the two together, it should have killed none of them.
But aluminum, is certainly not as well studied, I think, as has been thimerosal. You don't have that, got aluminum, didn't get aluminum study, because you really can't have it. I mean, some vaccines require adjuvants.
This chart from Dr. David Ayub, Southern Illinois School of Medicine, compares the aluminum and additional ethyl mercury content in vaccines given to children by 18 months. From 1970 to 1985, these children received 4 vaccines with both mercury and aluminum. That went to 5 in 1986, 10 in 1994, and 11 in 2000. Then in 2001, mercury was no longer added as a preservative, but was still present at 10% of previous levels, while shots containing aluminum went to 15. By 2004, 3 shots with mercury as a preservative were added back in, while aluminum-containing shots remained the same. By 2007, children under 18 months received 3 shots containing mercury and 17 containing aluminum. As of 2015, there are 10 shots with mercury added as a preservative and 6 shots with aluminum added as an adjuvant.
Can our immune response hurt us? Can that be the problem with vaccines? What our immune system does as a result of seeing a foreign protein?
Yeah, it's certainly true that some infectious diseases can cause your body to react against itself. thing. Campylobacter, for example, is an intestinal bacterial infection that can itself cause something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is this ascending paralysis. And Lyme bacteria, so-called Borrelia burgdorferi, can cause you to react not only to the bacteria, but also at the same time to the cells that sort of line your joints, causing a chronic arthritis. But there's no evidence that vaccines do that.
What has been shown in a lot of research is that mercury increases the susceptibility to immunological problems and also infection from bacteria. For example, if you take brown Norway rats that are susceptible to getting arthritis from a certain bacterial injection, they will do it much quicker and much easier if they're giving a dose of mercury before you give them the bacteria. In other words, mercury enhances the ability of the bacteria to penetrate the joints and start the arthritic condition. And we have done studies, and these are now published in some of the best toxicological journals in the world, looking at membranes that make up the cardiovascular system as well as membranes that line the intestine. And what we have found is that mercury and methylmercury and ethylmercury and thimerosal all cause those membranes to become very leaky. When those membranes become leaky, then the immune system loses its compartmentalization. In other words, the immune system is meant to be compartmentalized into your blood system. It's not meant to get into your intestine, nor are intestinal particles meant to get into the bloodstream intact. And when you are exposed to certain levels of mercury, you can open up these membranes and make them leaky, as you would see in leaky gut syndrome or in colitis and certain things. When you start getting this leakiness, then your immune system can go out, attacking places where it shouldn't be attacking and producing antibodies that it normally would never ever produce. This is the reason why a lot of people have antibodies to certain food products in their bloodstream that should never have ever gotten into the bloodstream. And the only way you can make those antibodies is to get that entire food particle into the bloodstream, and you do that by having a leaky membrane either in the arteries or in the intestinal tract.
But I think there's been now excellent data looking at children sort of who receive vaccines compared to those who didn't, to answer the question, are you at greater risk of asthma? Are you at greater risk of allergies? And I think the answer has been very clearly that you're not.
There's a study from Canada where they looked at the rate of asthma induced in children that got the vaccine at 2 months versus 4 months. And the asthma rate was much higher in those that got it at 2 months. He clearly selects the papers he wants to believe and ignores those that don't fit into his what he wants to believe set.
The critics of the genetic thing would say, well, there's no such thing as a genetic epidemic. Would you agree with that statement?
I don't think there's an epidemic of autism. I think if we went into a time machine and went back 30 or 40 years and used the same diagnostic criteria that we currently use to diagnose autism and introduce it into the community so that everybody is aware as they are now, and also make it very clear in that community now, 30 years in the past, that you will qualify for services if you have this diagnosis, I think you would find that the incidence of autism would be the same 30 years ago as it is now.
I think his idea that autism was at the same rate as it was 30 years ago indicates to me that this man does not read the literature and the science at all. Doesn't even, I mean, even from the Department of Education, they have put out, scores of information saying we have a boy problem. Our boys are becoming less scholastically capable, and they're not going to college. They're not even graduating from high school at the rate that they used to. And the amount of money we've been spending on children with neurological illnesses, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. I mean, I can't believe he says that. I mean, it tells me he does not read the literature, and I certainly hope he is much more critical when he reads the literature about making a vaccine, which he's supposed to be an expert in, than he is when he's reading other things on autism. He should not, with his comments, be considered at all any type of an expert about autism.